The Protected Disclosures Act 2014 provides a robust statutory framework which aims to provide protections to whistleblowers who raise concerns regarding potential wrongdoing in their workplace. These protections apply to workers in all sectors of the economy, both public and private, from being penalised by their employer for reporting wrongdoing in the workplace or suffering any detriment for doing so. The Act requires every public body to establish and maintain procedures for dealing with protected disclosures and provide written information relating to these procedures to their employees. In line with the Act, my department has a policy on protected disclosures which sets out the procedure by which an employee can make a disclosure, what will happen when a disclosure is made, and what my department will do to protect the disclosure, or disclosure rather. My department is committed to fostering an appropriate environment for dealing with concerns and assisting staff in speaking up regarding potential wrongdoing in the workplace and providing the necessary assistance for staff who raise genuine concerns. To date, no disclosures have been received from employees or former employees of my department under the Protected Disclosures Act.
I thank the Taoiseach for his reply, and to say that if one looked at the recent RT documentary, I think produced by Katie Hannon, in relation to the trauma that Sergeant Maurice McCabe, perhaps our most high-profile whistleblower, went through, one would have been struck by a number of comments that he made, and in particular he said that if he knew what he and his family would have had to go through, he would not have made the original complaint in the first instance. And I think that is something that must be very worrying to all of us, in terms of the sense is still out there that if you complain, if you do a protected disclosure, that you will pay for it in many ways. And all of us have been since then subject to many complaints, I suppose, or notifications of protected disclosures in different sectors of the public service. And standing back from it, what comes to my mind is the sense that within each department, within your own, within every state organisation, there should be a culture that would ultimately, if it was optimal, avoid the necessity for protected disclosures. My worry at the moment is protected disclosures are becoming more common, more frequent, and that in itself is an indictment of existing practices in terms of human resource development, mediation, within state organisations and within government departments. And a failure to head off prospective difficulties, and in many ways to reinforce the original negative behaviour to such an extent that it ends up in a protected disclosure. That impacts on productivity, it impacts on the well-being of an organisation, its efficiencies and its effectiveness. And so I think the whole idea of culture change within government departments is key. And I would ask that the government would take a more would take a reflective assessment of this. Why is it that we are inundated with so many serious and profound complaints, and why so many are now ending up as protected disclosures? And very often there is an absence of mechanisms by departments in coping with it. I'm aware of material in the Air Corps, for example, where very serious issues have been alleged in terms of the health and well-being and safety of Air Corps staff down through the years, and the degree to which it's been snarled in legalities, but also a certain obfuscation, a certain stonewalling of the original complaints that were made by members, and a lack of transparency and humanity in dealing with them.
Yeah, can I ask you, because one of the issues is obviously the culture in terms of within departments, and recently I have had receipt of a protected disclosure from a member of staff within the National Parks and Wildlife Service, and this individual has in the past made very serious allegations to management within the NPWS, particularly in relation to a serious issue, and that is the issue of ammunition and firearms within that department. I know that there was an audit carried out in relation to this a while back, but the reports or the results of that audit have never been published. And what is very concerning, Taoiseach, is that we now have a new standard operating procedure without any consultation with staff, which is the norm when you introduce a new SOP, and that operating procedure, it is alleged, is being used to carry out disciplinary proceedings against the individual who has made repeated claims, and they are claims against management and specific individuals and the policies within the National Parks and Wildlife, which go as far as to suggest that firearms could have been missing, stolen or otherwise including ammunition. So it is a very serious issue, and it is very concerning that while there is procedures in place to deal with the protected disclosure, there appears to still be a culture where the individual who is making such a disclosure is the subject of target intimidation and harassment. And I'm also aware, Taoiseach, and I'll finish on this here, that this is also a culture within the banks, and that senior people within certain financial institutions have made it clear that protected disclosures and those that bring it forward will be the ones who will carry the burden at the end of the day. So there is more than just the procedures that are needed and the legislation, but a dramatic shift in culture in how we deal with the individuals and protect them.
Brendan Howlin.
Firstly, I think that the protected disclosure legislation obviously was groundbreaking. It was modelled on best international practice at the time, a couple of years ago, very much in line with the open government initiative that Ireland signed up to when we were in government. But a couple of things I want to say to you, Taoiseach. Number one, the idea of it was that disclosures could be made to the closest level at which the issue to be addressed was made. In other words, you wouldn't have to go to the very top of any organisation. As it turned out, people feel, I think, inhibited and feel that they either have to go to the very top of the organisation or, in many instances, to members of the Oireachtas, which were provided for in the Act, rather than having the cultural space within public service for matters to be addressed immediately in the workplace by your immediate supervisor, knowing that that would be respected, that your confidentiality would be respected at that level, and that the issue would be seriously addressed. I don't think we've made that cultural shift yet, and it in truth will probably take a little time for that to bed in. I don't take particular heart from the notion that there hasn't been, in your own department, for example, any disclosure as necessarily an indication that there aren't things to disclose. I think we do need to ensure that people are secure, because I was very struck by the very point made by Deputy Martin, by the most significant whistleblower in our lifetime. It was a shocking thing to hear that he said that he wouldn't embark upon the pursuit of the truth the way he did had he known the consequences for himself and his family. So that is incumbent on us to change that, so that it doesn't become such a big issue, that where there is a concern about any procedure or concern about wrongdoing or concern about anything, that you can go to your immediate supervisor without fear of being exposed or intimidated or in any way adversely affected yourself, that matter will be fully ventilated, checked out, and that you will be confident that the matter is addressed. So I would hope that there would be a constant review of this, because it really is an important part of the reform suite of openness in the way we do our public business.
Deputy Joan Burton, finally.
Yeah, I wanted to ask the Taoiseach in the context of what both Deputy Howlin and Deputy Martin have said, and in terms of the new arrangements you've been making in relation to Garda oversight. It seems to me an almost impossible situation where the head of the Garda force, certainly in the cases that we've been talking about, was very often the recipient of the disclosures, putting that individual in an almost impossible situation. And I just wonder, Taoiseach, if you have been able to give some consideration to the new oversight body and indeed possibly GSOC, which I think will be the two bodies remaining,
There are a lot of questions. The Taoiseach, if we're to comply with the time, it's about 5 minutes.
Thanks very much. Last year, just in relation to the Protected Disclosures Act first, I think it was and is very much a reforming and innovative piece of legislation. I think it was Pat Rabbitt, the new chairman of TUSA, who originally put forward the legislation on this, although perhaps it was somebody else, but I remember supporting it from the opposition benches, and then Mr Howlin and some others bringing it through in the last government. And I think it is a good step forward in terms of reforming our legislation, protecting whistleblowers and making sure that serious allegations are properly investigated. It was part of a suite of legislation, and indeed is part of a suite of legislation to improve ethics in public office and in business, and that includes the Regulation of Lobbying Act. One of the countries in the world, in fact, it's held up now as an example of legislation around the world where lobbying is properly regulated in Ireland, much more so than it is in other countries. And we have legislation as well delimiting corporate donations and ensuring there's transparency around corporate donations. And it's so different to so many other democracies where there isn't whistleblower protection, where lobbying is very opaque and not registered, and where people can receive huge amounts of money in donations, sometimes public and sometimes private. And I think Ireland's actually a very good example to the world in some of the things that we've done in recent years, but we're far from perfect, and nowhere is. I think we always have to get the balance right. The balance is there to make sure that we protect whistleblowers, that we ensure that allegations are properly investigated, but we also need to make sure that we protect innocent people and decent people and organisations from being falsely accused. And we know that both have happened. We know from Charlton there was the module on Maurice McCabe and there was a module on the Keith Harrison allegations, and you can see how different those cases were. And I don't want to go into that in too much detail, but it does demonstrate to us the extent to which we need to support whistleblowers, need to listen to them, need to protect them, need to hear what they have to say, need to investigate their claims. But we also need to be cautious enough and sensible enough to know that all claims and allegations aren't true. And when false allegations and false claims are made by people, and when they're propagated in this House, and when they're then picked up by the media, that can do enormous harm to people who are falsely accused. And I think we need to get that balance right, and I think we're still learning as a society how to get that right. There is EU legislation coming down the line. As deputies will be aware, a European directive on whistleblowing, which will help to advise our legislation. And also problems do arise, and having had a little bit of experience dealing with some protected disclosures, a problem can particularly arise when the protected disclosure is not the only track that the whistleblower is following. When there's also a connected employment dispute, or sometimes a connected court case where they're also suing for financial damages. And that's where it can get very messy, where there is a case unfolding potentially in the courts, or a case with solicitors for financial damages, a protected disclosure being sent to a public body, and then even aspects of that then being raised here in this chamber and in the media. And that can create a real mess in dealing with it. And I kind of wonder whether it would be better if protected disclosures were dealt with in their own right, rather than ending up being connected with other disputes. And that's where it can get extremely difficult indeed. And you'll have people claiming legal privileges and so on because the protected disclosure is also connected to a claim that's going through the courts, and that's where it can get very difficult to manage. I think Deputy Micheál and Deputy Martin were correct in their remarks around a cultural shift. We don't want the Protected Disclosures Act to become the way people make complaints. It should be something that's used in reserved cases. People should feel that they can speak up, that they can make complaints, that they can call out wrongdoing when they see it, and they should have confidence in their supervisors and managers that those complaints will be taken seriously, those allegations will be investigated, and if not, the person above that person will deal with them properly. In terms of the review, the statutory review was published in July. That was following a public consultation, and there are 25 submissions from a variety of public bodies, interest groups and members of the public. The review considered international developments, including comparative analysis with legislation in other countries, and also detailed some of the early results of the implementation of the Act. Across 212 public sector bodies, 370 protected disclosures were received by the end of 2016. And the review shows that the Act is viewed as setting a positive example internationally and has led broadly to positive outcomes. It highlights some implementation issues which are being considered by the Department of Public Expenditure and Reform, including providing absolute confidentiality to disclosures while balancing fair procedures for other individuals concerned, the interaction of the Act with the GDPR legislation and other employment policies, as I alluded to earlier, and also disclosures that are made through multiple channels. And then there's a difficulty as well of anonymous disclosures and how you can investigate them when there's nobody to interview. In terms of amendments, this is being dealt with by the Minister for Public Expenditure at the moment. Any further amendments to the Acts will be considered in the context of the discussion taking place at EU level on the EU Directive for whistleblowers. So, as I indicated earlier, what we'll most likely do is leave the Act as it is now, but when the European Directive is finalised, we will then use that as an opportunity, the transposition of that as an opportunity to amend our own Act.